Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Donald Trump defies critics of his Gaza takeover as he claims Israel will turn the strip over to the United States after the fighting ends. Opposition lawmakers in India protest the ill treatment of Indian immigrants deported by the USA. Trump's team prepared to lay out peace plans to end the war in Ukraine. And Greece declares a state of emergency on the island of Santorini after days of earthquakes as thousands are evacuated. To our top story, and President Donald Trump says no US troops would be needed to rebuild Gaza, an effort he said would only happen after the fighting ends. His Secretary of State has called the president's proposal very generous, but it's drawn international condemnation. Nick Harper reports from Washington.
A landscape shattered by 15 months of bombardment, but still home to more than 2 million Palestinians. On Thursday, the Trump administration continued its push to take over the territory. President Donald Trump further elucidated on his plan, writing on social media the Gaza Strip would be turned over to the United States by Israel at the conclusion of fighting, and he promised no US troops would be needed. Earlier, Secretary of State Marco Rubio defended the president's proposal.
It was not meant as a hostile move. It was meant as I think, a very generous move, the offer to rebuild and to be in charge of the rebuilding of a place, many parts of which right now, even if people move back, they would have nowhere to live safely because there are still unexploded munitions and debris and rubble.
The White House says the US does not intend to pay for the rebuilding and now suggests the relocation of Palestinians would not be permanent.
The president's made it clear that he expects these nations in the region to step up and to accept Palestinian refugees who will be temporarily relocated for the rebuilding of Gaza.
Arab nations, world leaders and human rights groups have criticized President Trump's plan, and Palestinians in Gaza say they won't be forced out.
God is greater than Trump and America and Israel. We will not immigrate, and we are steadfast in our land. They destroyed our houses and killed our children, but we are steadfast.
The United Nations estimates it could take 21 years to remove all the debris from Gaza, an enormous undertaking, one Donald Trump wants to project manage, despite Gazans' determination to remain in the place they call home. Nick Harper, Al Arabiya News, Washington.
Let's go live to Tel Aviv to speak to our correspondent, Giles Gibson. Giles, good evening to you. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said there's nothing wrong with Trump's plans and claimed people who leave could come back. Tell us more.
Yeah, Benjamin Netanyahu made those comments in an interview that he did with Fox News over in the United States, talking about the idea of Gazans being allowed to leave the Strip if they wanted to. As you mentioned, he said, what's wrong with that? He also described President Trump's wider plan, wider vision for Gaza as a remarkable idea that he said should be examined. I think the big question as well that's on many people's lips is whether Benjamin Netanyahu knew that President Trump was going to unveil this plan, this vision for the future of Gaza during that extraordinary press conference at the White House in Washington. There are some reports that Benjamin Netanyahu was briefed by senior US officials the day before about this plan that the president had really wanted to put forward, but also many observers have been pointing out that there was a little bit of surprise on Benjamin Netanyahu's face as he was watching President Trump deliver those marks from that podium at the White House.
Yes, indeed. Surprise body language, maybe. Other nations have strongly opposed the controversial idea that's triggered this enormous backlash. In the last few hours, a spokesperson for the Palestinian president's office has opposed the plans. What exactly have they been saying?
Well, we've actually also had a statement from Mahmoud Abbas himself, in terms of a written statement, the Palestinian president, saying that this proposal by the US president would be a serious violation of international law, and very strongly saying that we won't allow the rights of our people to be infringed. That condemnation of this plan from Mahmoud Abbas follows off the back of regional countries also very strongly saying that they do not want to see any sort of plan that involves the displacement of the Palestinian people. You have Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, all coming out to say a similar thing, take a similar stance. And really, what we saw in that press conference was President Trump outlining that these are the countries that he expects would take in Palestinian refugees if they are removed from the Gaza Strip. And so, yeah, those countries coming out and saying that they are not going to take in any Palestinians, that they are against the idea of Palestinians being moved from what they say is their home, that really is seen as undermining the credibility of this plan. Now, I've just lost connection with you, so I'm gonna have to throw it back to you in the studio.
Giles, thank you so much. That was our reporter there who is currently in Tel Aviv, Giles Gibson. Thank you once again for joining me. Now, opposition parties in India are criticising their government for not speaking up against the alleged ill treatment of deported illegal migrants by US authorities. 104 Indians arrived from the US on Wednesday, with pictures showing some of them in handcuffs and iron chains around their legs. Ishan Garg tells us more now from New Delhi.
America must respect universal human dignity. These were the words of a member of parliament from the federal opposition Indian National Congress Party. It came shortly after several opposition party MPs staged a protest outside the Indian parliament. They say the US has treated Indian deportees inhumanely by shackling them throughout what was nearly a day-long flight from the US to India. They are also criticizing Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government for being silent on the issue. India's Minister of External Affairs S. Jaishankar says restraints are part of the US government's deportation protocol. Nonetheless, he says India has asked US officials to ensure deportees are treated with respect.
We are, of course, engaging the US government to ensure that the returning deportees are not mistreated in any manner during the flight. At the same time, the House will appreciate that our focus should be on strong crackdown on the illegal migration industry, while taking steps to ease visas for the legitimate traveler.
Local reports say some 20,000 undocumented Indians are facing deportation in the US. Pew Research estimates that India is the third largest source of illegal migrants after Mexico and El Salvador. New Delhi says it is firmly against illegal migration. The subject was at the top of the agenda when India's foreign minister met US Secretary of State Marco Rubio in Washington last month. Though critics have raised several concerns about President Donald Trump's mass deportation threat, Rubio says it is an efficient way of stemming illegal migration. His department says it sends a message of deterrence to those considering entering the US without proper documentation. As the Indian government looks to maintain close ties with the Trump administration, which Jaishankar has called an out-of-syllabus question, cooperation on migration could be crucial. It's a subject that is expected to dominate the agenda during Prime Minister Narendra Modi's meeting with President Trump that's likely taking place next week.
Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. California utilities say it's likely their equipment sparked one of the Los Angeles fires that broke out on January the 7th. At least 29 people died and over 200,000 were evacuated, and many lost their homes as fierce flames did blaze across the region. Damage to the area could be as much as $50 billion, with insurance claims expected to exceed $20 billion. People in Sweden continue to grieve after the country suffered its worst mass shooting earlier this week. At least 11 people, including the gunman, died, with 5 others seriously wounded after shots were fired at an adult education centre outside of Stockholm. Police continue to investigate the suspect's motives for the attack. Swedish media named the perpetrator as 35-year-old Rickard Andersson. London's Grenfell Tower, the 24-storey building which caught fire 7 years ago, killing 72 people, is now set to be demolished. The government's decision to dismantle the social housing block has been met with anger from bereaved families and survivors of the disaster. Some campaigners had hoped the building would remain as a reminder of the tragedy, whilst others wanted it replaced with a memorial. Last month was the world's hottest January on record. 2025 broke the 2024 record by almost 0.1 degrees Celsius. Experts believe the rise in temperature is down to greenhouse gases. However, scientists do not fully know why the January just passed was particularly hot. And scientists in Australia have created the world's first kangaroo embryo via an IVF technique. Researchers at the University of Queensland are confident this breakthrough could save other endangered species like the koala, the Tasmanian devil, and the northern hairy-nosed wombat from possible extinction. Technology giant Google has become the latest big US firm to scrap its diversity hiring targets. It joins a growing number of companies that have abandoned or scaled back their diversity, equity and inclusion programs. The decision came in the wake of an executive order issued by President Trump aimed at pressuring government agencies to scrap their DEI initiatives. Officials in the US have detected a new strain of bird flu in dairy cattle in Nevada, raising concerns about the spread of the virus. Since April last year, the H5N1 strain has reduced milk output in cows, pushed up egg prices, and infected nearly 70 people. Experts say the discovery raises questions about the wider spread of the virus. Britain's next ambassador to the United States, Lord Peter Mandelson, has said his past comments about President Donald Trump several years ago were childish. Mandelson previously called Trump a danger to the world. The former Business and Trade Secretary told the New York Times he regretted his choice of words as he prepares to become the UK's top diplomat in Washington. In what's being claimed as the world's first, dog treats made from lab-grown chicken have gone on sale at a major pet store in the UK. The food, developed by Meatly, combines plant-based ingredients with cultivated meat, which is made by growing a single sample of cells from a chicken egg. The firm claims the treats are just as tasty and nutritious as traditional chicken breast treats. Now, Donald Trump's team will present a much-anticipated plan to end the war between Russia and Ukraine at a conference in Germany next week. Trump's special representative for Ukraine and Russia, Keith Kellogg, is expected at the event in Munich. The discussions will take place between the 14th and 16th of February. Now, that's 1 week shy of the third year of the war. We can now go live to Kyiv to speak to our correspondent there, Stuart Smith. Stuart, good evening to you. Keith Kellogg will be meeting with European leaders during his trip and reporting back to President Donald Trump. What are we expecting the plans to include, and when could we hear them being unveiled by the US?
Yeah, so Keith Kellogg is the man to watch here. He's the special representative for Ukraine and Russia, and he's been appointed by Donald Trump to try and make progress where there has been very little, even over the last few years. His aim, he says, is to have a discussion with allies and European leaders and then report back to the president with what he talks to them about. He says he's not going to make any public statements or announce what he's been saying. He says that's for the president to do, but perhaps, as has happened in the past, certainly leading up to the initial discussions right after Russia's invasion in 2022, there will be parts of that plan that do end up leaking, either deliberately or accidentally. What this could look like might seem at the moment still even quite impossible. For example, it's been floated by President Macron of France, and Prime Minister Keir Starmer of the UK has suggested he's looking into the possibility of deploying peacekeepers. That would be the UK and France deploying peacekeepers as NATO countries in Ukraine, which of course is something President Putin has spent much of this war trying to avoid. It may look like Ukraine giving up plans to join NATO, but then also having other security guarantees provided to it from the West. And so all of these ideas would, though, inevitably require some concessions, including, as has been mooted in Moscow, the possibility that Russia would have to be allowed to maintain all its territorial control over those annexed regions, including Crimea.
So Kellogg has expressed that the US is keen to see elections take place in Ukraine following this possible ceasefire that could be put on the table. You and I have previously discussed Trump wanting access to Ukrainian minerals. How much sway does the US actually have when it comes to leading on these peace negotiations, Stuart?
Yes, and President Zelensky too has said he's willing to have those elections once the war is finished and martial law is over, which is why elections cannot happen now. They're banned under martial law, but the US is essential in these discussions. And it's interesting also to note, to look at the rhetoric coming out from Moscow. More often than not, you hear the Kremlin and President Putin talking about his war with the West. Ukraine is just the special military operation, which is part of that wider war. From the Russian perspective, it has an issue here with the West more than it does with Ukraine, because it's a fear about the West, and especially the United States, using Ukraine as a vessel to harm Russia. That's the Moscow perspective, and therefore it's almost more important from the Russian perspective to be able to talk with President Trump than it is with President Zelensky. But he's absolutely firm on that matter. He will not allow for negotiations to take place without Ukraine being involved.
President Zelensky actually seems to be open to having talks with Russia, something he said. Trump has threatened Moscow with these massive sanctions if they don't engage in discussions. We know economically they're suffering. Do you think all of this is going to bring us to a truce between Putin and Zelensky anytime soon?
Yes, and Russia is still suffering from around 1,500 losses each day militarily. It's taking its toll on Russia, that's for sure, but there's no seeming urgency in Russia in the same way that there is here in Ukraine, where territory is being lost far more quickly than Russia, and then Ukraine is regaining it, and also with the threat of Western weapons drying up, particularly from the United States. So they are willing to talk now. They've been making statements towards that effect, suggesting the stance from both is softening. Both Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has admitted that he will, at a push, if it's the only way to peace, have a conversation with President Putin, something he called already a major compromise. And similarly, the Kremlin says that President Putin is open to negotiations with Volodymyr Zelensky, even though it says he's not a legitimate president. So they're open to talking, that's true. But again, to stress, Russia is most interested, seemingly, in talking with the United States and President Trump than with President Zelensky. And there was a suggestion from the Kremlin that intensification of efforts to create those talks are happening in the last few months since President Trump became leader of the US. Those discussions have gone up between Russian and US agencies. And also we heard just today from Leonid Slutsky, the chair of the International Relations Committee in Russia's parliament. He was saying that he believes a meeting between Trump and Putin is currently at an advanced stage, and it will take place soon, for example, as early as February or March.
Stuart Smith in Kyiv, thank you so much for joining me. A state of emergency has been declared in Santorini as a strong earthquake is recorded between the Greek islands Amorgos and Santorini. Hundreds of tremors have been hitting the region for days, and there are fears a larger quake could strike. More than 11,000 people have already left Santorini. Tourists and locals who live in the area have been explaining just how this is impacting them.
We are not worried about the earthquakes. We've been feeling them all day, little light ones. We're from where our country has, and our state that we lived in had big earthquakes back in the day.
Well, and generally, of course, we're a little bit concerned, I have to admit. It's something out of the ordinary. I mean, we have had tremors throughout the years, but sporadically.
I came from Tokyo. In Japan, as you know, every day we will meet the earthquake. So the earthquake level is a magnitude 4.3 or something. It's not very dangerous.
We can now speak to Professor of Earth Scientists at Oxford University. That's David Pyle. David, good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining me. First of all, how rare is it for the region to see multiple tremors like it's been experiencing lately?
Yes, so this is a seismically active region, but it is actually very rare to see such a large number of earthquakes in the same region in such a short period of time. So the earthquakes are mostly 20 to 40 kilometers away from Santorini, but since the 31st of January, as we heard, there have been 1,000 quakes or more, many of which have been large enough to be felt on the island of Santorini.
Authorities are being cautious due to fears a larger earthquake could actually strike. We know schools on Santorini have been shut down, and we also know that this has happened on some of the neighbouring islands, and armed forces are also on standby. Are scientists correct to predict a larger earthquake is on its way?
So I think the scientists are certainly right to put safety first, and I think the main concern at the moment is actually of uncertainty, that scientists know that these sorts of swarms of earthquakes can continue for an extended period of time. It is certainly possible that the earthquakes could get larger, and it is possible that the sequence of earthquakes could end up with a significant earthquake. So we really don't know how likely or unlikely that scenario is. So I think the best, very, very much the right thing to do is what the authorities are doing, because we haven't yet seen significant damage, but it wouldn't take a much larger earthquake sequence in order to start to cause damage.
So you talk about a possibly bigger earthquake sequence. How likely is that activity to trigger something like volcanic activity or a possible tsunami in Santorini?
So the scientists are keeping a very close eye on this. So we have the volcano of Santorini and a submarine volcano called Colombos, and then these faults and earthquakes all within the same region. So geologically, we think that there are connections on a geological scale, but we don't actually know what the connection will be between the earthquake activity and the volcano itself. So for now, there's no sign that there's anything untoward on Santorini, but that's definitely being monitored very closely. The chance or the risk of having a larger earthquake that then causes a landslide that then causes a tsunami is probably quite significant. So again, this is a reason for, we don't know whether there's going to be a larger earthquake. We do know that there are steep cliffs on Santorini which are unstable. And so that's the reason for the caution.
I've been lucky enough to go to Santorini, actually, and so far, as you say, there's been no significant damage and no injuries, but you just mentioned there that it is very rocky and there could be slides that may occur. What precautions should people on the island be taking right now, just to avoid any risk?
So again, the Civil Protection have made some very good advice recently, which is to keep away from the cliffs, empty the swimming pools to minimise the risk of catastrophic damage if there's an earthquake. I think keeping away from old masonry structures or being aware of where those old masonry structures are is obviously important. And I think, as we heard on the news, there's a state of emergency. So in fact, many of the residents of Santorini have now departed. But of course, the modern buildings on the island will all be built to seismic building codes. So I think the main advice is to keep away from the cliffs.
David Pyle, Professor of Earth Sciences at Oxford University. Thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Thank you.
Let's take a look at the top business news. The Bank of England has lowered interest rates by 1/4 percentage point to 4.5% today. The central bank's outlook shows inflation is expected to peak at around 3.7% in the third quarter of this year, higher than previously expected. The BOE also halved its forecast for growth this year to 0.75%. Indian tax authorities have sent a confidential notice to South Korean car maker Kia, accusing it of evading millions of dollars in taxes. According to Reuters, the amount could be as high as $155 million, and the notice was sent in April last year. Kia has sold more than 1 million cars in India since its launch in 2019. Turning to sports news now, and Donald Trump's executive order banning transgender girls and women from sports participation is facing enforcement questions. Current options for introducing the ban range from looking at birth certificates, which can be changed, to inspecting the bodies of children, which many people do deem unacceptable. And Brazilian striker Neymar says the feeling of playing for Santos again after 12 years away from the club was indescribable. The 33-year-old returned to the Brazilian club from Saudi Arabian club Al Hilal last week. Neymar impressed in the second half as he now returns from injury. A reminder of our top stories. Donald Trump defies critics of his Gaza takeover as he claims Israel will turn the strip over to the United States after the fighting ends. Opposition lawmakers in India protest the ill treatment of Indian immigrants. Trump's team prepared to lay out peace plans to end the war in Ukraine. And Greece declares a state of emergency on the island of Santorini after days of earthquakes, as thousands are evacuated. And that's all from us on W News. Thank you for joining us. Coming up next, special interviews with professional golfers Sergio Garcia, Ian Poulter, Hendrik Stenson and Cameron Smith. And don't miss Tom Burgess Watson with GNT. Good night.